Pyongyang that goes beyond the
some carrot
in lifting of sanctions, I would think.
Before I start, I'd like to draw your attention to a painting behind me. If you don't look at it carefully, you might wonder it is the bird's eye view of Seoul, but actually it's Pyongyang. I was told this morning that one of the pen ink artists in Korea made efforts to draw this painting for 3 months, and it resembles very much the landscape of Seoul. Allow me to start up with a question, which is, how will historians in the future define the Korean Peninsula 2018? Considering the factors at play now, I believe Chairman Kim Jong-un must play a time game. He must produce tangible results. That is Presidents Moon and Trump. If he misses this golden opportunity, I believe he will end up greatest regrets. Chairman Kim may feel uneasy with the nuclear program, but if the economy fails, it will mean a certain end for him. Therefore, South Korea and the United States, along with the international community, should devise and present a plan for economic benefits and detailed ways to realize those benefits through North Korea's denuclearization. Fortunately, we have overcome the worst-case scenario of whether to go to war or not, and have started talking about peace. It could be a long and difficult road, and so I express my deepest appreciation for taking this time to bring your collective wisdom together.
Please welcome to the stage Admiral Ambassador Harry Harrison.
That there is not a more dynamic place to serve as the U.S. ambassador and no better partner for the United States than the Republic of Korea. And earlier this month, Secretary Pompeo made his 4th visit to Pyongyang, where he again met with Chairman Kim Jong-un. In addition, Chairman Kim agreed to allow inspectors to visit the Punggye-ri nuclear test site and Tongchang-ri missile engine test site, and hinted at possible opening of other facilities even more central to North Korea's missile and nuclear processing capabilities. Now, we are, of course, cognizant of the priority that President Moon and his administration have placed on improving South-North relations. I believe, and as President Moon has said, this inter-Korea dialogue must remain linked to progress on denuclearization. Only in this way will the prospects of achieving our common goals with the North be their greatest. We will continue to work with you and with our friends and partners throughout the Republic of Korea to achieve our common goals. Thank you and 감사합니다.
핵 위협도 없는 평화의 땅으로 만들기 위해 적극 노력해 나가기로
peace and reconciliation. Priority has always been on denuclearization.
Without denuclearization, there would be no peace on the Korean Peninsula.
누구도 먼저 비핵화 이래 디레일 내려올 수 없는 지금 그러한 절묘한 상황이 됐습니다.
Because there hasn't been progress on the denuclearization question. So I wanted to kick off with a question about is the potential that there is a division within the U.S. administration. Say the president has one view and the bureaucracy has another. Is that a gap, and how big is it?
So I think there is a gap there. Now we've kind of slid into a much more conventional process where you have Secretary Pompeo, Steve Biegun, these trail of negotiations that is eventually to lead to this second summit. And that I think most people feel more comfortable with because there's a process there with the summit meeting as sort of the action forcing event. The variable again is that while all this work will have been done in advance of Trump-Kim 2, nobody knows what's going to happen in that meeting. Bureaucracy on the US side is very focused on the things that we talked about. I mean, the declaration, the verification, the timeline. If that's what's not on offer, then establishing at least a verification precedent for anything that the North does, or expanding the scope of what's going to be offered by North Korea on Yongbyon that goes beyond the 5-megawatt reactor to, all 8.9 square miles of the site. So I think many of us who look at this feel very comfortable with the way that the bureaucracy, the intelligence community, the negotiators are looking at it. But the big unknown variable is the president. And I think for some, the concern is that, I talked earlier about a bad deal. A bad deal could be one that might look bad to the bureaucracy, but could be acceptable to the president, because I think that the threshold for what might be considered good could be very different.
I think early on, this is what gets interesting, I think, in the U.S. side. I think the president was quite interested in that approach. The two times the summit was canceled and then the Pompeo trip was canceled. What was going on there?
I've decided to terminate the planned summit in Singapore on June 12th. If and when Kim Jong-un chooses to engage in constructive dialogue and actions, I am waiting.
Especially the Pompeo trip being canceled, is that a sign of a more bottom-up approach starting to reassert itself within the administration? I think that's an interesting thing. The second is, there's no really good comparison on the U.S. side for how they are going to approach this top-down. So the closest thing, those of us in Washington, are trade relationship with China, right? In other words, it started out very personal. It started out very president-oriented, and it wasn't clear where the bureaucracy was going to play in the U.S.-China economic relationship. And over time, you saw the president himself reject deals brought to him by the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Treasury, and now it seems that there's been more of an equilibrium established between the United States Trade Representative's office, and while the president has maintained a good public relationship with Xi Jinping, the bureaucracy's gotten quite tough on trade and other issues. So I think that's the question. Are we headed for a more equilibrium that has more drivers from the bureaucracy in the U.S., or are we going to still essentially try to make another run at this sort of three-person leader level type approach that I think the South Koreans are pushing?
What about the view from South Korea on the potential for a gap in the U.S.?
If you look at North Korean news media, that kind of intentional wedge between President Trump and his administration, I think it might have to do with special character of President Trump. For instance, he did, just right after the Singapore summit meeting in June, he argued that Korea-U.S. joint military exercise is provocative. And he also mentioned about the possibility of reducing or withdrawing U.S. troops from Korea.
We have right now 32,000 soldiers in South Korea. And I'd like to be able to bring them back home, but that's not part of the equation right now. We will be stopping the war games, which will save us a tremendous amount of money.
A Korea-U.S. alliance have nothing to do with the denuclearization process. In the sense, we were quite disappointed by the remarks of President Trump regarding U.S. troops in South Korea without any consultation or without any coordination. So that might be being exploited by Pyongyang throughout the whole process. So we must be very careful.
The current administration may be more aligned with sort of Trump's view to be optimistic and positive about the progress that has been demonstrated so far and sort of emphasize more kind of symbolic gestures and peace, as it were, efforts versus denuclearization, taking on board your point that they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but there is a certain extent to which the sort of symbolic gestures are would have been very much welcomed here in Seoul.
Historically, I think the priority has always been on denuclearization. This focus on peace clearly represents the preferences of the most active driver of this whole negotiation process over the last year, and that has been the government here in South Korea. But more important than who is in the lead is the level of coordination among the United States, South Korea, and Japan. Historically, in these negotiations, when we do not coordinate well, it does not work to our benefit. In fact, it usually only benefits the North Koreans when we are not well coordinated. South Korea says a peace agreement is really necessary to get to denuclearization. It's a necessary component in this path towards denuclearization. And while that may be so, I think for many in the United States, it's exactly the opposite. But what we don't want is peace for a bad denuclearization deal. I think for most in Washington, D.C., there are three components of a good deal. That is a comprehensive declaration, verification by an outside body, the IAEA, of that declaration, and then a timeline for dismantlement.
그래서 저는 세 분하고 조금 다른 관점에서 좀 말씀드리고 싶은 게 세계의 목표가 북한의 비핵화였는데 북핵을 가진 뒤에 북한의 핵 외교는 상당한 정도로 성공을 하고 있고 국제사회의 비핵화 외교는 의견 차이를 보이고 있는가. 문재인, 트럼프 두 대통령의 2인 삼각경기는 처음에는 밀리터리 옵션도 고려하던 트럼프 대통령을 대화와 평화적 외교를 통한 북핵 문제 해결의 그러한 그 레일로 올려놓았습니다. 문재인, 김정은 2인 삼각경기 이스루 레그드 디플로머시는 처음에 대화 단절에서 대화를 통해서 핵실험과 미사일 발사를 중지하는 그러한 3-legged race 2인 삼각경기를 복원시켰습니다. 이렇게 해서 문재인 대통령의 중재를 통해서 미사일 발사 핵실험을 하고 밀리터리 옵션을 검토하던 김정일 위원장과 트럼프 대통령과 문재인 대통령이 대화와 비핵화, 평화적 비핵화라는 커먼 링, 공통의 링과 공통의 레일에 올라갔습니다. 김정은 위원장이 이 레일을 먼저 뛰어나간다면 그것은 밀리터리 옵션을 감수해야 될 뿐만 아니라 세계적인 가장 강력한 아마 제재에 직면하지 않을 수 없을 것입니다. 문재인 대통령은 중재를 통해서 이 커먼 링, 커먼 레일을 만들었기 때문에 여기서 내려간다는 것은 상상할 수 없습니다. 그래서 저는 핵의 완전한 불능화 체제에 합의할 수 있다면 그 정도를 저희가 출구로 해가지고 국제적인 비핵화의 연대를 복원해서 여기에 집중하고 다음 단계로 완전한 궁극적인 폐기로 넘어가는 그러한 2단계 접근은 어떨지 하는 생각을 해봤습니다.
I mean, in many ways, because the panel is framed as peace and denuclearization, we're looking at these things as linked. What we see is South Korea and China, North Korea, pushing very hard towards a peace declaration, and then all the pressures on the United States to agree with a peace declaration, even though we don't get what we want on denuclearization. And then we look like we're the enemy of peace on the peninsula, which is historically not the case. That's not the U.S. position at all.
About the possibility of linking that more to sort of a reduction of conventional threat,
right. Yeah.
which is something that's very important in South Korea that perhaps Americans don't understand as viscerally as people living in Seoul.
So why not push forward on a peace track for conventional force, reducing the conventional threat? That doesn't mean they will be disincentivized to act on the nuclear issue, because if they want sanctions lifting, that's only going to come with steps on denuclearization and on human rights abuses. So we think about it in terms of not what we want, but what we think the North Koreans want. It might lead us to a different conclusion or a different way to look at these two goals.
Perhaps Ambassador Lippert, you could talk. If you were writing the roadmap, what would you say needed to be the top 3 items on it?
I think the linkage issue between peace and denuclearization I think you can kind of argue it round or flat. It's an interesting question, right? There's no doubt. Bring the two goals together. I think it's concessions from North Korea. The reason there's some strain in the two goals, and I think the North Koreans are intentionally playing to some of these strains, is because there hasn't been progress on the denuclearization question. And I do think if there were some meaningful concessions, I think that would go a long way to putting lubricant and oil between these two goals and basically show, look, the approach is more or less working, and we have some success on which we can build, which I think would help, facilitate trust and confidence in the U.S. ROK approach.
I think one of the most important thing is both the two Korean people, we must not lose this opportunity. Unprecedented opportunity. Chairman Kim Jong-un, if he would lose this most important opportunity, I don't think he can take or he can change again this kind of so important opportunity. Especially President Trump now, I think he has some mind to take or to postpone the time of the whole denuclearization period, I think so.
So what should the president ask for in the second summit? Because one of the criticisms of the first summit was that the declaration was very, very vague.
It's clear what the North Koreans are trying to put forward, which is essentially to allow some outside verification of measures they've already taken. This is decommissioning the nuclear test site, as well as maybe the missile site, and then maybe the 5-megawatt reactor, the reprocessing building, the fuel fabrication facility at Yongbyon, which again, I think is not good enough. I mean, I think freeze on fissile material production, I think that's very important. But the other thing I think for all of us in this room who have worked on this issue before, the big, whatever you want to call it, the 600-pound gorilla in the room is not the plutonium program, it's the uranium program. We knew it was there, but the North Koreans were not letting us get it. Clearly, that is a much bigger program today than it was then. And so any agreement that's going to pass muster, I think, in Washington has to at least start making inroads into that second and newer program that has been, that will be the source potentially of many more bombs in the future.
Yes.
I'm just going to make one quick comment asking what would you like to see out of a summit. I don't know if this is possible, but I'm a big believer in a declaration is a key indicator that the North is serious. It gets to Victor's point about you can see if they're going to bring the uranium parts in, at least on paper. The North Koreans know that we have a reasonable understanding of their program, and if you have a serious declaration, it would probably be a good indicator if the North is serious. A lack of a serious declaration or a lack of a declaration at some point in the near future, I think also speaks volumes to the North Koreans' lack of seriousness.
He wrote me beautiful letters. We fell in love.
북한의 새로운 선택과 노력에 화답할 차례입니다.
Well, they won't do it without our approval. Without our approval.
First of all, our alliance is heading for rough waters.
America's profits first.
I'm not sure if we have a coordinated policy.
That kind of a readjustment will be inevitable.
Since the inauguration of anti-establishment President Donald Trump, traditional Korea-U.S. alliance or U.S. foreign relations in general began to squeak. Before and after the election, President Trump has said Fed should be pulled from South Korea to Portland, American boys or USFK should be brought home. It's time to ask whether Korea and the U.S. or chorus could continue to sing together in the chorus.
First of all, our alliance is heading for rough waters. I'm not saying we're in rough waters. We're heading for it. The winds are up. They're in our face. We can feel them. The only two people, as far as I can discern, who have confidence that Kim Jong-un is sincere as President Donald Trump and President Moon Jae-in. Our bureaucracy is scared to death about what may happen at a summit with Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un. And they're only slightly less frightened about what may happen at the summit that follows in Seoul, as we, for sure, watch Chairman Kim go walkabout among the citizens of Seoul, probably not unlike he did in Singapore. If Kim Jong-un is not sincere, and we've made these small concessions, we're actually giving him a running start if he had negative ideas about invading the South. Follow that by the discussions of sanctions that Foreign Minister Kang had in the National Assembly when there was a discussion about the possibility of removing the 24 May sanctions, and this precipitated, as I understand it, a rather difficult phone call from our Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo. And his main complaint, I think, was that this was done without any consultation of the United States, and we've been leading this international.
If North Korea reaches so-called complete denuclearization, I think the readjustment of ROK U.S. alliance and the U.S. military presence in South Korea, that kind of a readjustment will be inevitable if North Korea reaches the final destination. But until now, North Korea has not even taken the first step of denuclearization, like nuclear freezing or declaration of their nuclear program list. North Korea could pursue, I would say, a quote-unquote, a partial denuclearization, which is trade U.S. concerns such as ICBMs and non-proliferation, in return for the recognition of North Korea as a virtual de facto nuclear weapon state, which has normalized diplomatic relationship with the United States. If it is the case, I think ROK, U.S. have to maintain their strong defense posture unless they are willing to accept partial denuclearization. So this is one thing I want to emphasize, because partial denuclearization refers to the situation in which South Korea and USFK will remain very vulnerable to nuclear-tipped short to medium-range ballistic missiles that are already deployed in the whole North Korean territory.
트럼프 대통령의 아메리카 퍼스트 폴리시는 제가 생각하기에는 아메리카스 profits first. 어떠한 방식이든 좀 이 가시적인 뭐 돈이든 어떻든 물질적인 profits가 있지 않은 한은 북핵 문제에 있어서나 한미 FTA에 있어서나 또는 한미 동맹관계에 있어서나 그런 관점에서 본다. 그래서 스트래테직 SH 한반도 전개와 관련해서 지금 한미 간의 버든 쉐어링 논의를 하고 있는데 그 전략자산 배치 비용을 대라고 주장하는 것이 바로 그러한 생각에서 나온 것이 아닌가 생각을 하고, 반면에 이제 문재인 대통령은 모든 것을 인터-코리안 relations first 이렇게 정책을 접근하니까 폴리시컨 상대방의 그 기본 입장에 대한 양측의 기대치가 좀 달라서 폴리시 컨설테이션이 의도한 바대로 잘 이루어지고 있지 않다. 그래서 그것이 바로 종전선언 문제와 관련해서 미국과 한국의 입장이 차이가 났기 때문에 그거 뭐 한국 정부가 원하는 방식대로 종전선언이 제대로 이행되고 있지 않다.
What do we do to, I think you in part asked this question, Professor Khan, what can we do to strengthen U.S.-ROC alliance moving forward? I do think that there's no question that if the U.S.-ROC alliance is to survive for another 7 decades plus, I do think U.S. have to continue to work with South Korea to continually deepen, broaden, upgrade, modernize, transform the alliance, broadening it from the original purpose of deterring and defending against North Korea to partnership that includes political, economic, diplomatic, cultural, all of that, all of the cooperation on all those fronts. And the more the alliance expands beyond the original threat-based rationale, to an alliance that's based on common values, I think less likely that any future deal between US and North Korea or between inter-Korea, that could somehow lead to the end of US-ROC alliance. And meanwhile, South Korea's relationship with Japan, which we haven't brought up, is still, I think it's troubling one for the United States. It is a relationship that is still probably one of the most troubled relationships between liberal democracies. And we all know why, over lingering issues, over historical issues and comfort women and so on. But from Washington's perspective, this less than ideal relationship between South Korea and Japan does jeopardize important US interests, including trilateral cooperation on North Korea, making it difficult and hampering our ability to respond effectively to China.
Obviously, we lack the common goals or common approaches, or we have different priorities. Is there any way we can fix this problem? We can come up with a common goal, common approach. What can we do?
The final destination for the North Korean problem is kind of exchange of North Korea's denuclearization with US-North Korea diplomatic normalization. That means if North Korea takes the first step of denuclearization, North Korea probably expect some sort of a reciprocal step from the United States. I think the best one is the exchange of liaison officers rather than putting the end of war declaration on the table. That is complicated a lot of our conversation and discussions at the moment, because this is a much broader issue. Even though South Korean government is claiming itself as a facilitator or mediator, but end of war declaration is not just a bilateral issue. This is the big issue that will be impacting upon the whole Northeast Asian security architecture. That's why I think we need to switch our thinking from peace declaration to more concrete steps, such as the exchange of liaison officers. Then I think we can coordinate more concrete manner rather than in abstract manner. The peace and the war, very abstract, provokes a lot of unnecessary imagination.
We all know that there is a big lack of trust between North Korea and the United States. That's a big problem. If that's the case, and we know what they want, the United States want North Korean denuclearization. North Korea wants peace regime and lifting of sanctions and normalization of relations with the United States. If that's the case, how about set a date, the enforcement date, which I would call D-Day, then we let the world know. And North Korea knows that they're not going to be betrayed, because all the world knows, and if they complete the denuclearization, they will get the fruits on the D-Day.
That might sound good in theory. In fact, I think Secretary Pompeo on September 19th came out with a timeline. And unfortunately, President Trump, 2 weeks later, sort of then reversed or undermined his...
But we're not playing the time game. If it takes 2 years, 3 years, or 5 months, it doesn't matter.
Secretary Pompeo's own statement when President Trump said, why do we need to get into this timeline, or I don't need to rush Kim Jong-un. So that might sound good in theory, but I think it's kind of unrealistic, and I don't think the South Korean government is on board. President Trump just said he's not going to be going for a timeline, so that's unfortunate. Another problem is verification. What do you mean by timeline when everything is wrapped up? Because verification itself could take, I don't know how many years. There are people who are saying it could have to take up to a decade. It's a very complex process. So I think it might be good in theory, but it's still somewhat artificial in terms of, or it's not, that doesn't have buy-in either by the Moon administration or President Trump. Part of my frustration with the US policy right now, you said earlier that North Korea has a strategy. North Korea's strategy is pretty easy. I think for all the Korea watchers, it's not hard to figure out what North Korea's strategy is. I think I pretty much got what President Moon's strategy is too. We can agree or disagree, but he has a strategy. Problem with Washington is I'm not sure if we have a coordinated policy, because one thing comes out from the bureaucracy, which we talked about, then there's also President Trump, which we talked about earlier this morning. And that's kind of part of the frustration and difficulty right now.
예를 들어서 종전선언 문제를 다루려면은 미국이 한반도에서 종전선언을 했을 때 전후, 그리고 앞으로 어떤 일이 벌어질 것인가에 대한 미국 측의 생각과 종전선언을 먼저 해서 북한이 비핵화를 촉진시킬 수 있다라고 생각하는 한국 정부, 현 정부의 생각이 솔직하게 어떻게 다른가를 협의를 해야지 그 종전선언 문제가 정책으로 나타날 거 아니에요. 그런데 제가 바깥에서 한국과 미국의 폴리시 컨설테이션 결과를 언론을 통해서 본 바에 따르면은 그러니까는 종전선언이 미칠 앞으로의 결과에 대한 미국의 생각과 그것에 대한 한국의 생각이 서로 차이가 있기 때문에 아주 진지한 협의가 되어 있지 않다. 그런 점에서 이제 폴리시 컨설테이션이 중요성을 다시 한번 지적을 하는 거고.
Just a word on peace declaration, and I absolutely agree with Professor Park that if there is going to be a peace declaration, and I do think momentum is towards that, really from everybody, South Korea, China, Russia, and North Korea, on getting a peace declaration done. I do absolutely think there has to be, this time, really a concrete understanding of what that is with North Korea. We should not repeat what happened with Singapore Declaration, which is part of the problem is there was no agreed upon real understanding of that, right? There was all these different interpretations. So for sure, if there's a peace declaration, I'm sure North Korea is going to have one interpretation, US is going to have another. South Korea may have yet another. So we need to agree on the definition, the implication, what does that mean for United Nations Command, US versus Korea, Combined Forces Command, all of that. And then there's a management of domestic and international perception. Often, you hear from the South Koreans that this is just a political statement. It doesn't really mean anything. It does mean a lot, and it is a slippery slope towards peace treaty. What about managing the domestic and international perception of a peace declaration, right? It does have also more other implications as well.
Well, in this order, the first one, which issue represents the biggest challenge to U.S.-ROC coordination, sanctions enforcement? We have a couple issues interrelated to each other to some extent, but
I don't consider any of those huge obstacles. Those are normal business, every one of them. I think the more difficult thing now is where we are on the verge of a possible divergence of understanding of how to proceed in North Korea. That is the issue. These are all housework, the U.S.-ROC alliance, because that is homework. And the two sides have to do that. And we've done it so many times, 9 times in the past.
Although that sanctions enforcement part, relaxation of sanctions, that would be part of the coordination. I would say so out of all that, that's where the US and South Korea needs to be sort of on the same page with, because that is policy towards North Korea that's happening right now. I would say that's more important than some of these other issues.
I agree with Dr. Terry in that it was a peace declaration, but all of a sudden, the North Korea and the South Korean authorities switched the topic from peace declaration to the relaxation of sanctions, which means ROK and the United States are pressed to discuss about this issue. Otherwise, they tend to believe we are very unlikely to strike the impasse, to break the impasse that we are facing at the moment.
혁명의 새 승리를 향하여 힘차게 앞으로 나아갑시다.
I can see North Korea's future is very bright.
Market economies that don't have authentic market signals.
본격적인 민간 투자가 들어갈 수 있는 환경이 전혀 아닙니다.
It would take a complete regime change before investing.
혁명의 새 승리를 향하여 힘차게 앞으로 나아갑시다.
I can see North Korea's future is very bright.
Market economies that don't have authentic market signals.
본격적인 민간 투자가 들어갈 수 있는 환경이 전혀 아닙니다.
It would take a complete regime change before investing.
In this last session, we're going to set up our own hypothesis, that is, the North Korea's denuclearization has been realized. So we're going to go for the second stage, that is the economic development of North Korea.
I think North Korea has great potential, mainly because the location of fantastic markets are available. Also, technology can be given by other countries. Investors are ready if conditions are met. Also, we have to emphasize North Korea as latecomers in transition, and the possible integration with South Korea is great benefit. Nowadays, we estimate income per capita of North Korea is about $750. If North Korea transforms toward the market economy and be integrated in South Korean economy, then I estimated North Korea's growth rate for time, say about 20, 30 years, will up to 13% per annum. Also, South Korean economy benefited by this integration. The growth rate of South Korean economy will be about 0.7 to 8% point higher than usual scenarios. So it's a lot of potential, but I have some concerns about whether these benefits can be realized. North Korea has experienced widespread marketization, but this marketization is from below, not from top, as we observed in China. Therefore, the money they earned from other activities, from trade, etc., are not mobilized into manufacturing sector, which is basis for sustainable growth. That is North Korea's problem nowadays.
Therefore, we could say that the North Korean economy is in the course of open economy. Is it really true?
Openness can be measured by data, but data do not tell us about the quality of this openness. So in one sense, yes, it's an open economy in terms of the share of trade in GDP, but it's not open economy in terms of institutions. But still, the state-controlled WACU is trade licenses of enterprises, institutions. Unless you have this WACU licenses, they can't involve in trading. And a lot of corruption takes place in trade. For example, some companies which export coal to China have kickbacks from Chinese importers. But I think it's more importantly, internal dynamics it takes place because of marketization. These markets are real place where households can basically can't work at official places because jobs are not available, because they can't receive wages sufficient for their surviving. There are 480 universal markets. These are fee-paying 장마당. So traders have to pay fees. Therefore, this 장마당 may be called formal markets. But there are many informal markets, places where people get together. These places, people just bring their food and the consumer goods and try to sell them at the informal markets. These people are called grasshoppers because they have to wrap up what they try to sell when policemen try to arrest them.
I found Professor Kim Byung-yoon's economic analysis very interesting and very useful. But I would caution against using economics to describe North Korean motives or behavior. We know that North Korea's primary interaction with the global economy is illegal and illicit. It involves counterfeiting drugs, currency. It involves Bitcoin, cyber theft. In fact, the overwhelming strategy of the regime to generate income is illegal and illicit. And so transactions, contracts, these are all things that North Korea has historically violated. I did a seminar on doing business in North Korea, and the students did case studies and interviewed Cargill and other companies, including European companies, Egyptian companies that invested in North Korea, and their conclusion was it would take a complete regime change before a multinational, at least a U.S. company, could feel confident investing. So in conclusion, I think the administration in Washington should maybe be a little more flexible about IMF. Allow IMF teams to go to North Korea, see if they can collect data. That would be a good early test.
Mr. Michael Green gave us a lot of sort of cautions about the feasibility of whatever programs that we propose to North Korean government.
지금 현재 이집트의 오라스콤 같은 회사가 북한에서 핸드폰 사업을 성공적으로 했다고는 이야기하지만 북한에서 그 수익금을 이집트로 가지고 나갈 수가 없습니다. 그래서 아직은 북한은 대규모 민간 투자, 본격적인 민간 투자가 들어갈 수 있는 환경이 전혀 아닙니다. 그런데 북한이 이제 IMF 가입하고 국제사회로 진입하게 되면은 ODA, Official Development Assistance라고 부르는 공적 개발 원조도 북한에 많이 들어가게 될 것입니다. 뭐 지원이라고 해도 좋습니다. 북한을 도와주게 된다면 자, 고속철을 먼저 건설해야 되겠습니까? 아니면 북한의 철도를 현대화시키는 게 먼저가 돼야 되겠습니까? 고속철 개발 건설 같은 것은 10년, 15년 뒤로 미루고 북한 주민들이 직접 혜택을 받을 수 있는 철도라든가 도로, 그리고 기본적인 상하수도 시설, 항만, 기반적인 포트라든가, 그다음에 이제 기본적인 또 전력 같은 공급이 이루어져야 되겠죠. 이런 것들이 먼저 이루어져야 됩니다. 그것들이 먼저 이루어져야만 북한의 본격적인 민간 투자가 들어갈 수 있습니다.
Now you have to say this took a significant turn over the last 3 to 4 years when Xi Jinping launched One Belt, One Road, because it's really the cornerstone of a larger thing that's going on with China, and that is a very dedicated effort to create a parallel alternative international economic system to the Bretton Woods construct. I was intrigued by your discussion of bullet train versus freight modernization. I mean, the real issue is which of any of them are economically viable? Their sustainability, their economic sustainability, not just as political science fair projects, one-off to demonstrate some political agenda. Are these economically viable? And are they economically viable in the context of this remarkable build-out of infrastructure that's going on throughout Asia? How does that fit with where Korea is moving its economy? Are you going to be manufacturing goods where it's optimal for you to use these rail networks? I think there's an awful lot of research that has to be done here. It doesn't make sense to talk about building rail infrastructure to connect to One Belt, One Road without understanding, is this economically viable or sustainable? There's an enormous amount of research that has to be done that isn't being done. Now, I would say this is something that we could be doing right now that would not violate the sanctions environment.
그리고 햄리 이사장님 말씀에 이제 제가 동감을 하는데 한 가지만 말씀을 드리면은 이제 우리 태평양 건너서는 아시아를 볼 때 아시아는 다 비슷하지 않을까 이런 선입견을 가지고 계시는 것 같습니다. 근데 사실 그렇지는 않거든요. 우리가 보통 1대1로라고 하지만 중국이 얼마 전에 이런 용어를 바꿨습니다. 원벨트 원로드에서 벨트 앤 로드로 원을 떼버렸습니다. 떼버린 이유가 뭐냐면 하도 이렇게 전 세계가 중국의 그 행동, 무브에 대해 가지고 이제 그 염려를 하니까 그런 염려를 털어내기 위해서 원벨트, 자기들만 가지고 있다는 건 아니죠. 그래서 이제 벨트 앤 로드로 바꾼 사례도 있습니다. 이 1대1로 중국의 벨트앤로드가 미국이 주도하는 이 브레튼 우즈 시스템에 대항을 한다고 이제 그 미국 쪽에서는 볼 수 있을지 모르지만 제가 이제 그쪽 분야를 전공을 한 학자의 입장으로서 중국이 미국의 패권을 견주기에는 너무 미약합니다, 사실은. 그래서 한국이 중국하고 더 가까워진다. 앞으로 상황이 좋아지면 그러면 한국이 미국이 별로 효용 가치가 없어서 중국 쪽으로 가게 된다고 생각하는 것은 저는 미국의 그 일종의 편견에 가깝다고 저는 생각을 합니다.
Yeah, I hope I wasn't misunderstood. I don't think Korea is going to abandon the Bretton Woods system. I mean, I really don't, and I don't want them to. But I do think that China is going to create a closed authoritarian mobilization model and try to expand it within Asia. They have a market of, 1.3 billion people already, more than enough to create and sustain that model. Clearly, Xi Jinping has doubled down on that. Clearly, they're intimidating neighbors, if you want to participate in this market, you do it under our terms. What I worry about is my government is by its behavior, is probably going to encourage it, which isn't constructive, about what these railroad projects are like and what it means to connect into market economies that don't have authentic market signals in the marketplace. They have political signals in the marketplace. And this is going to be a Bretton Woods economy that's going to be competing into a much larger economy that uses authoritarian mobilization concepts for access and activity. So I'm just saying this has to be studied. This is a time to study this clearly and objectively.
Let me check some of the questions that flow. After the denuclearization, how long would it take for the North Korean economy to claim that their economy is succeeding?
I think North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has genuine thoughts about economic development. I don't know whether he wants to become Deng Xiaoping. I doubt it. If he really wants to become, say, like Deng Xiaoping, then it may take about, say, 10 years, 15 years to establish market economy in North Korea. If you look back on East European countries, it took about at the most about 15 years to establish a market economy. When they privatized large-scale enterprises quickly enough, and when they set up institutions quickly enough, it may take about 15 years. But if they follow a Chinese way of transformation, it may take more than, say, 30 years. As you pointed out, some enterprises still state-owned.
남한에서는 조금 급하게 생각하는 마음들이 많은 것 같습니다. 우리가 다 할 수 없습니다. 그리고 다른 급하게 생각할 필요가 없습니다. 그리고 우리가 나서서 북한을 어떻게 가르친다는 생각은 좀 버려야 될 것 같습니다.
The question of a plan for North Korean economic development is useful, helps us think this through. I think it's extremely unlikely we'll get to implement that plan, and then I think if we had a plan, we'd find it had to be changed as soon as we tried. But it's useful because we want to try to entice Kim Jong-un to think about that kind of future. It's very important when we do it that we be very clear about the conditions. I don't think it helps to pretend this is going to be something that the North Korean regime gets just because of diplomacy. They will have to do their homework. They will have to work with the IMF. They will have to provide transparency. They're not going to have a convertible currency, but they're going to have some kind of monetary system. That's the kind of thing. The United States needs a strong Korea and a strong Korean economy. And in order to weather unification and contribute to North Korea, I hope people in the audience and people watching will think about what Korea itself can do to get itself on a strong economic trajectory, which we all really hope for and really need.
I hope our endeavor would be reported by Rodong Shinmun tomorrow morning, but whether it is reported or not, that's our hope and endeavor to make the North Korean economy come to the international community with its own pride and with its own unique values. Thank you very much indeed.
JTBC